Newport, Rhode Island, July 25th, 1965. The summer air hung thick with anticipation as 17,000 folk music devotees gathered at the hallowed grounds of the Newport Folk Festival. Backstage, a 24-year-old Bob Dylan adjusted the strap of his electric Fender Stratocaster, its cherry sunburst finish gleaming under the stage lights. His hands, those same hands that had cradled an acoustic guitar through countless protest songs, now gripped an instrument that would shatter everything. The crowd roared with expectation. They wanted their prophet of protest, their acoustic messiah who had given voice to a generation's struggles. They wanted Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin'. What they got instead was a 3-chord thunderbolt that would split the folk world in two. As Dylan stepped into the spotlight, the first electric notes of Maggie's Farm erupted from the amplifiers like a declaration of war. The crowd's cheers turned to confused murmurs, then to something darker, something that would echo through music history. Bob Dylan had arrived at Newport 4 years earlier as Robert Allen Zimmerman from Hibbing, Minnesota, a scrawny kid with a harmonica and dreams bigger than the Iron Range. By 1965, he was folk music's golden boy, the voice of civil rights and anti-war movements. His acoustic anthems had become the soundtrack of social change, performed at marches and rallies across America. But Dylan was suffocating. The folk purists who had crowned him their king now demanded he remain frozen in amber forever, the earnest troubadour with his acoustic guitar and righteous fury. They owned him, or so they thought. The Newport Folk Festival, founded in 1959, had become folk music's most sacred ground, where authenticity was currency and electric instruments were considered sacrilege. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about music, it was about identity, authenticity, and artistic freedom. Dylan stood at the crossroads between the folk movement that had made him and the rock revolution that was calling his name. On one side lay the comfortable prison of expectation. On the other, the terrifying freedom of reinvention. This is a story about the courage to betray your own image, the price of artistic evolution, and the moment when an artist chooses growth over comfort. It's about the tension between authenticity and expectation, the way institutions can become prisons, and how the greatest artists must sometimes destroy what they've built to create something new. At its heart, it's about a young man who refused to be anyone's property, even his own past self's. The transformation began months earlier in a dingy recording studio in New York City. Dylan had been experimenting with rock and blues, drawing inspiration from the British invasion and Chicago blues legends. He'd grown tired of being labeled a protest singer, a box that felt increasingly suffocating as his artistry evolved. "I'm not a protest singer," he'd told journalists, but they kept asking about his message. The folk establishment had created a monster of expectation, and Dylan was beginning to feel like Frankenstein's creature, assembled from their desires rather than his own vision. The spark came during the recording of Bringing It All Back Home earlier that year. Working with electric instruments felt like coming home to a language he'd always known but never spoken. The energy, the raw power, the ability to layer meaning beneath walls of sound, it was intoxicating. Folk music's earnest simplicity suddenly felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. The folk establishment's reaction was swift and brutal. When Dylan released Bringing It All Back Home, with its electric side, purists recoiled as if he'd committed blasphemy. Folk magazines ran articles questioning his authenticity. Radio DJs who had championed his acoustic work suddenly turned cold. "He's sold out," became the common refrain. He's gone commercial. The very people who had lifted him to stardom now felt betrayed, as if Dylan owed them perpetual fidelity to their vision of what he should be. Privately, Dylan wrestled with doubt. Was he abandoning his principles? The civil rights movement was at a crucial juncture, and his protest songs had become anthems of hope. Was walking away from that responsibility an act of artistic integrity or selfish abandonment? The weight of expectation pressed down like a physical force, making every decision feel like a betrayal, either of his fans or himself. Enter Al Kooper, a young session musician who would become Dylan's secret weapon. Kooper understood what Dylan was trying to achieve, not abandonment of his message, but evolution of his medium. You don't have to choose between having something to say and saying it with power, Kooper told him during late-night recording sessions. Kooper helped Dylan see that electric music wasn't a betrayal of folks' values, but an amplification of them. The raw energy of rock could carry Dylan's poetry to new audiences, could make his messages hit harder and reach further. Together, they began planning something unprecedented, bringing full electric rock to the holiest shrine of acoustic folk music. Newport, 1965, was supposed to be Dylan's coronation. He was scheduled to close the festival, the undisputed king returning to his throne. But backstage, word spread like wildfire. Dylan was bringing an electric band. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band would back him, and they were bringing amplifiers. Festival organizers panicked. Pete Seeger, the folk movement's elder statesman, allegedly threatened to cut the power cables with an axe. "It's too loud," he shouted during sound checks. "This isn't what Newport is about." The battle lines were drawn before Dylan even took the stage. The media sensed blood in the water. Reporters who had once fawned over Dylan's every word now sharpened their knives, ready to document either a triumph or a spectacular fall from grace. The story was irresistible. The folk prince was either evolving or betraying everything he'd once stood for. Fans began choosing sides. Letters poured into folk magazines. Some supported Dylan's right to artistic growth. Others felt personally betrayed, as if their favorite cousin had joined the enemy. The intensity of the reaction revealed how deeply Dylan's acoustic persona had penetrated the cultural consciousness, and how threatening his electric evolution felt to those who had invested their identity in his image. As Dylan prepared for his set, the opposition crystallized. A group of festival board members held an emergency meeting, debating whether to cancel his performance entirely. The sound system mysteriously malfunctioned during his rehearsal. Technical difficulties that seemed suspiciously targeted began mounting. Dylan's own confidence wavered. Standing backstage, listening to the crowd's roar of anticipation, he knew he was about to shatter their expectations. Was artistic integrity worth alienating the very people who had made his career possible? The weight of the moment pressed down. This wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration of independence that could end his career. His band members grew nervous. The Butterfield Blues Band was used to hostile crowds, but this felt different. These weren't just music fans, they were believers whose faith was about to be tested. The amplifiers hummed ominously, electric harbingers of the storm to come. Minutes before taking the stage, Dylan made his choice. In a moment of clarity that would define his career, he realized that betraying his audience's expectations was less important than betraying his own artistic vision. "They don't own me," he muttered to Kooper. "Nobody owns an artist but the art itself." He strapped on the Stratocaster and walked into history. The first electric chord of Maggie's Farm hit the crowd like a physical blow. Confusion rippled through the audience, followed by something uglier, the sound of thousands of people feeling betrayed simultaneously. But Dylan didn't flinch. If anything, the boos seemed to energize him. He leaned into the microphone and delivered his lyrics with newfound power, the electric backing band providing a wall of sound that made every word hit like a hammer blow. This wasn't retreat, it was revolution. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Dylan played only 3 songs before leaving the stage to thunderous boos mixed with confused applause. Backstage, he was reportedly in tears, not from regret, but from the emotional intensity of the moment. But something extraordinary happened in the weeks that followed. The controversy made front-page news across America. Suddenly, everyone was talking about Bob Dylan. Not just folk fans, but rock fans, pop fans, people who had never heard of the Newport Folk Festival. The Electric Dylan reached new audiences while forcing his original fans to confront their own assumptions about authenticity and artistic growth. Within months, like a Rolling Stone, Dylan's 6-minute electric epic became his biggest hit, reaching number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song's success proved that Dylan's electric evolution wasn't a betrayal of his artistic vision, but its fulfillment. He could be profound and popular, meaningful and electric. The Newport controversy became a watershed moment in American music. It marked the end of folk music's cultural dominance and the beginning of rock's ascension as the voice of a generation. Dylan had shown that artists could evolve without abandoning their principles, that authenticity lay not in unchanging consistency, but in honest expression of one's current truth. A generation of musicians learned from Dylan's example. The Beatles, who had started as pop entertainers, began incorporating deeper meanings into their music. Folk singers like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young embraced electric instruments without losing their poetic souls. The rigid boundaries between genres began to dissolve, creating space for artistic cross-pollination that enriched American music immeasurably. Dylan himself never looked back. He continued evolving throughout his career, embracing country, gospel, blues, and countless other styles. Each transformation sparked controversy among fans who wanted him to remain frozen in their favorite era, but Dylan had learned the lesson of Newport. An artist's only obligation is to their own artistic truth. Years later, Dylan would reflect on Newport with characteristic ambiguity. "They booed," he said in interviews, "but they were also listening." He understood that the controversy itself had been part of the performance, that sometimes an artist's job is to make people uncomfortable, to force them to question their assumptions about art and authenticity. The folk establishment eventually forgave him, recognizing that his electric evolution had actually expanded folk music's influence rather than diminishing it. Pete Seeger, who had once threatened to cut the power cables, later admitted he'd been wrong. "It wasn't the electricity that bothered me," he said. "It was that it was so loud you couldn't hear the words." Today, Bob Dylan's 1965 Newport performance is remembered not as a betrayal, but as one of music history's most courageous moments. The young man who walked onto that stage with an electric guitar didn't just change his own career. He changed the entire landscape of American music. Dylan, now in his 80s and a Nobel Prize winner, continues to tour and record, still evolving, still refusing to be pinned down by anyone's expectations. He proved that the greatest artists are not those who give audiences what they want, but those who have the courage to give them what they need, even when they don't know they need it. The lesson of Newport echoes through every artistic revolution. Growth requires the courage to disappoint those who love you for who you were in order to become who who you're meant to be. Sometimes the greatest act of respect for your audience is refusing to respect their limitations. Next time you hear an artist accused of selling out or going commercial, remember the young man with the electric guitar who chose artistic honesty over comfortable conformity and changed the world.